a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to say a few words about some of the work that we've been doing that actually ties very neatly with the global study within the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. But I want to make a few general remarks at the outset. I often try to make the point that almost every single child rights issue on the African continent, every single child rights issue is critical for the African continent. And I think one of the main reasons why that is the case is because of the unique demography that we actually have on the continent. There was a very interesting, currently, as you know, maybe some of you don't, we currently have about 47% of the African continent composed of persons below the age of 18. It's the only continent that has close to 50% of its population being below the age of 18. There are some projections that have been done by a number of organizations, including UNICEF and so forth, that actually give an indication that by the year 2050, we will have 40% of the children, the world's children here on the African continent, and 42% of newborns that will actually be happening here on the African continent. So you don't have to take it from me. You have to take it from the data, actually. There is no continent in the world whose future actually depends significantly on children than the African continent. So this conversation that we're having on deprivation of liberty, if you're not convinced about the human rights arguments, you should be actually convinced about the demographic argument, because it's absolutely critical for the continent. Now, having said that, I'm going to say a few words about the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. It's been around since 1990. It came into force in 1999. It has very peculiar provisions that are relevant for children, deprivation of liberty, and so forth. It currently enjoys 49 ratifications, the last one being this year by Sao Tome and Principe. As the African Committee, as the body that monitors the implementation of the Charter, we're working very hard to actually get universal ratification of the Charter by all African countries. But of course, 49 is a very good number to work with. But there are a couple of peculiar elements that I need to mention. Article 17 on the administration of juvenile justice is critical for the conversation that we're having here today. One of the positive things from the ratifications that we've seen on the African continent is the fact that even though there are 4 countries that have entered reservations, no country, and these countries are Mauritania, Egypt, Botswana, and of course Sudan. None of these countries have actually entered the reservation to Article 17, which is actually very helpful for the issue on children deprived of their liberty. Egypt has entered the reservation on Article 30. Article 30 is the provision that actually talks about children that are imprisoned with their parents. And unfortunately, Egypt has entered the reservation on that, along with a number of other provisions. At least in the 2 of the reservations that they've entered, the African Committee has said that these reservations are invalid. We will have to see in moving forward whether or not the reservation that Egypt has entered in relation to Article 30 is invalid. Now, having said this, Article 17 is relatively comparable to Article 37 and Article 40 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It provides for some of the basic principles about assistance and so forth. There are a few elements that it actually doesn't provide. For instance, deprivation of liberty as a measure of last resort and so forth. I personally wouldn't lose sleep over that. Why? Because the African Charter actually recognizes the notion of the more conducive environment or the more conducive provision. That is provided under Article 1. It's not hidden somewhere further down the line. It's actually provided up front. That if you, as a state party, have a higher obligation under either domestic law or other international or regional law, then hallelujah. The Charter is not going to quibble with that. It actually appreciates that, and it actually expects you to comply with that higher standard. So Article 37 and Article 40 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child actually play a supplementary role to what is provided under Article 17 of the African Charter. Now, when I was preparing for my remarks this morning, I thought I would identify 2 or 3 issues, particularly given the fact that time is very limited. And I thought I would spend a bit more time on some critical issues that I thought would be critical for the African continent. The first one is the issue about the military or national security-related deprivation of liberty. Now, we can look at a whole range of countries on the African continent. We can talk about Sudan, we can talk about Mali, Niger, South Sudan, but I'm going to focus on Nigeria and Somalia. Why? For the simple reason that just a couple of weeks ago, the African Committee of Experts actually had a presentation on deprivation of liberty in those 2 countries, but also because of the fact that when Nigeria came to the African Committee of Experts, we actually had a very detailed conversation about children that are deprived of their liberty because of alleged association with Boko Haram. Or children that are actually born from wives that were wives to Boko Haram fighters and so forth, so forth. So that's a conversation that we've had with the state party. Now let me come to Somalia. one of the sad realities that's happening on the ground in Somalia is that not only are the children are being deprived of their liberty because of alleged association with Al-Shabaab, they're actually, some of them, when they're being tried, they're actually being tried by military courts. And Somalia is not really a country, is not really a country that actually tries children through the criminal process and so forth. And of course, because of the current situation that they face, and they have faced this situation for a long period of time. Now, one of the interesting things that has happened in Somalia is that when we as a committee have a conversation with national authorities, the commitment that you get from the national authorities is very positive. But at the regional authorities level, it's absolutely abysmal. Government at the national level says that, look, we are aware of these children that are deprived of their liberty. We're actually going to hand them over back to the child protection authorities and so forth. But at the local level, the local authorities do not necessarily comply with that guidance that is provided by the national authorities. We have had instances where the National Intelligence and Security Agency is actually the main institution within the government framework that is actually dealing with the children that are deprived of their liberty. It's actually the main institution that is depriving of the liberty of these children. And as you can imagine, a number of these people are not frontline officers. They're not necessarily people that are trained in terms of children's rights and so forth. So the violations of children's rights in this context is actually very high. We have seen significant increase since 2015 of these children that are deprived of their liberty within the context of Somalia. And unfortunately, because the numbers are absolutely huge, even when there have been some successful stories, for instance, since 2015, the government has actually released about 250 children. It's not really a point for celebration, because the deprivation of the liberty of these children, that first of all, we don't have the correct data. And secondly, often when you even have some indication of data, it's an underestimate. And thirdly, because the deprivation of liberty is actually very big, these releases that actually have taken place after long negotiations, like weeks of negotiations, including the United Nations, are usually a drop from an ocean portion of what is actually happening on the ground. Now let me come to Nigeria, a very similar situation. And as I said, these are children that are deprived of their liberty because of alleged association with Boko Haram. We have seen instances, for instance, between 2013 and 2019, there has been a figure that has been pushed around about 3,600 children that were deprived of their liberty. Almost half of these are actually girls. And of course, deprivation of liberty is not a sex-neutral, it's not a gender-neutral exercise. And there are a number of instances where the victimization and the vulnerability that the girls face is often much more than what the boys face. And in some circumstances, depending on the attendance situation, the vice versa is also true. Now, again, in Somalia, the numbers, 3,600. There has been a release of about 2,200. And again, I wouldn't say it's a drop from an ocean portion, as I have said in the context of Somalia, but still it's a very significant number. And the number that we should actually be working towards is actually the number 0. Now, let me highlight 2 or 3 points from the situation that is happening in Nigeria. First of all, these children, in the majority of instances, close to 90%, are deprived of their liberty in an arbitrary manner. Even when they get released with no charge. We have, Human Rights Watch has actually done a very fascinating study, and I encourage you to actually look into it. It came out now September 2019. They even found out that some children, one child was deprived of liberty, was 5 years old. Some others 5 years old. One was deprived of his liberty because of selling yam to Boko Haram fighters. And the reasons, even though the government of Nigeria keeps on making the argument that these are high-risk children, one of the findings of the research is the fact that in a number of instances, the outcome for the boys particularly depends on their clan origin, depends on their economic background, which is absolutely a concerning situation for the African Committee of Experts. And I'm going to flag one point that we have experienced when we actually undertook a mission to Uganda in the context of the Lord's Resistance Army. One of the interesting things that we actually found from that mission, it's been many years since that was done, was the fact that government actually rescued children from the Lord's Resistance Army, but they kept them actually behind barracks for a number of reasons. One, they said they wanted to investigate. Secondly, they actually said that they want to use the children to help them identify the catchment areas. So they were actually using them as part and parcel of the military. Now, one of the critical lessons that we've learned from the exercise in Somalia and Nigeria is the need for handover protocols. Countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, they have already signed handover protocols with the United Nations, what the procedures to be followed are, what the right authorities for handover are, what the timeframes, what the critical timeframes in this regard are, and so forth. But unfortunately, neither Nigeria nor Somalia have actually done that. And within the African Committee of Experts, we're actually working to see that materialize. Let me move to a second issue, which is the issue of children imprisoned with caregivers. One of the added values that the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child does actually comes from Article 30. Don't get me wrong, I love the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it doesn't have an equal provision that you can actually find within Article 30 of the African Children's Charter. It's very explicit. The drafters were actually long-sighted, and they actually saw that this issue is a critical issue, and it remains to be one after 25 to 30 years. So they provided a number of details there. And in fact, the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child said that because this is one of the added values of the African Children's Charter, because this is actually a critical issue within the African continent, we decided to do our first general comment on Article 30. And it remains to be valid. There are a number of interesting things that are actually covered within the 17 pages. For instance, the definition of mother, even though it says mother, we've said that, look, we're going to expand this because it doesn't make sense to just refer to mother. And I haven't heard any state party to the African Charter that has actually come forward to the African Committee and said that this is mandate creep. No, it's not mandate creep. It's the year 2019 now. At that time, 2013, it was important to understand the context and make sure that the word mother is not defined in a very restrictive manner, but should also include fathers, but also any other caregivers. And in any case, those of you on the continent and even beyond, you understand the notion of mother is not very limited within the African continent. I can promise you how many people tell me that they are actually my mothers, that they actually contributed for my upbringing and so forth. There is a reference to special treatment, and we've also explained that the reference to special treatment is not just only to the children, but also to the mothers or the fathers or whosoever is a caregiver in this particular case. The role that parole boards play, the role that screening courts play, and the reference to S versus M is one of the issues that we identified in that general comment. Now, in this regard, 2 points that I just want to flag are, first of all, the importance of information management. There was a very sad case many years ago, and I'm not going to mention what country, where a child was living in the prison system for a long period of time, and the mother was executed because it was a death penalty case. The child continued to live in the prison because nobody within the prison system knew who this child actually belonged to. So the critical role that information management system actually plays in relation to this issue is absolutely critical. Now, the second point that I just want to mention is that, you know, it's the truth. We've seen it state party report after state party report that our prisons on the African continent, let alone for children, they're not even suitable for adults. That's the reality. If you want to get a little bit of dose of that, you just need to read the annual human rights report that the United States of America has been putting together for the last many years. And we have seen a couple of countries, and I'm not going to mention in the region, where during the dry season, the children that are actually within that are deprived of their liberty with their parents actually suffer from malnutrition, stunting, and so forth, because during the dry season, the availability of food in these prison systems is quite minimal. In one prison that we have heard a report from, the situation was that the food is dispensed, because of shortage, is dispensed from a very high window. So it becomes survival of the tallest. If you can actually reach that level where the food is being dispensed, if you can actually push around people, then you will be able to get a piece of the cake. But if your family, if your mother is not in that position, then your situation actually worsens, particularly because of the shortage of firewood. So what we have tried to provide as a recommendation to state parties is to emphasize non-custodial sentences and have a closer look what custodial sentences will actually mean for children that actually belong to that father or mother. The third point, I would be remiss if I don't spend a few minutes on, is the issue about migration-related detention. Now, I know for a fact that if you just only follow on Al Jazeera or BBC and so forth, there is a lot of sentiment from the continent against the West, including on deprivation of liberty in the context of migration. But here on our own continent, we are depriving the liberty of our own children within the African continent. And there are a number of examples of that, including within the region that we're actually discussing today. We have had a case, and some of it is because of lack of alternatives. We have had a case where children were trafficked from Ethiopia, and they were stranded in Malawi. And the judge actually referred the children to prison because her argument was that there are no alternatives, and if these children are actually released, the traffickers are waiting outside to continue the trafficking process to South Africa. When we started the conversation, there were about only 23 children. At the end of the conversation, there were about 50-something children. And one of the critical issues that actually stood out from that conversation was who is going to pay for the repatriation of these children back into their country? And quite a number of our countries are actually being caught off guard because, first of all, the alternatives are not there. Secondly, those who are actually decision makers feel handicapped because of the fact that options are not there. I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 related issues, and I'll move to the next issue. Development aid for migration control remains to be a very serious concern that is actually contributing to the deprivation of liberty on the African continent. And I don't mince my words on this, particularly in relation to the European Union. Because there are a number of instances where children are being sent back. This started in 2015 during the migration crisis. There are a number of instances where children are being sent to Cameroon, to Niger, to Nigeria, to Gambia, without the necessary paperwork, without the necessary identification of who will be a guardian when these children are actually being sent back, without taking into account how old the children are, without making a differentiation between unaccompanied and accompanied children. And that remains to be a concern within the work that we do as the African Committee of Experts. Now, there are also positive news in relation to deprivation of liberty and migration-related contexts. There are alternatives. For instance, there are examples. A strong presumption against detention in law. The recent refugee law of Djibouti is a very good example in this respect. There have been examples of shelter models where children can actually come and go without being deprived of their liberty. There have been examples of the West African Network in a case management system for migrant children across 16 ECOWAS countries. And one of the added values that this network has also provided is to make communication easier within the countries, but also set the standards in a harmonized manner. Because the differentiation of standards is one of the challenge that we face in terms of repatriation, in terms of the kind of conditions that children should be benefiting from. Zambia is currently busy removing, and they might have already done it, the reservations to the Refugee Convention to permit the right to work and freedom of movement. And often, as it often happens, the challenge that the parents face usually cascades itself to the challenge that the children face. And this is something that should absolutely be welcome. Now, if time was on my side, I would have said a word or two about administration of juvenile justice, the challenge in relation to minimum age of criminal responsibility, the differentiation that we make between formal and informal justice system, and some of the added values. Examples from South Africa, I think Professor Skelton will say a word or two. But I would also have like to say a few words about children in institutions. But in that regard, let me mention 2 points. One is children that are accused of witchcraft, that find themselves in detention, is a very important issue for a number of countries within the continent. And the second one that we have experienced from our mission that we did in Tanzania is the situation of children with albinism. Most of you would know, for instance, in the case of Tanzania, they actually removed the children from their families into these so-called institutions or shelters to actually protect them. That happened in 2008, 2009. Some of the children have actually become adults in those institutions. Some of those children have been sexually abused in those institutions, and there is a very concerted effort. Unfortunately, there is a bit of progress in the last few years. There is a need for a concerted effort to make sure that those children are actually outside of those institutions and should not continue to be deprived of their liberty within that context. My concluding remarks. We have to take the study forward, but we need to identify the national priorities for every single country. Because one size fits all is definitely going to work. Data remains the biggest challenge. In a number of instances, when countries actually have data, it's not disaggregated data. One of the shortcomings in the children's rights work that we have seen in the context of the MDGs, unfortunately, it's also rearing its head in the context of the SDGs, is the notion of national averages. It doesn't have the implementation of the convention. It doesn't have the implementation of the charter. It doesn't help us in the context of addressing the issue of children deprived of their liberty in a very targeted manner. So it's not about national averages. It's about disaggregated data. We need to have a conversation. The cost of inaction is something that is often falling between the cracks. States, and I promise you, we have had conversations, states after states, often mention about what it will cost them to actually address this issue. They don't have a conversation about what it is costing them not to address the issue. And those of us who are actually involved in advocacy, we need to be able to make a very strong argument what the cost of inaction in this respect is. The African Union is going to launch its first report on migration in Africa, I think in the coming couple of months. I encourage those of you who are interested on issues of migration to pay very close attention to that report. Because it will be interesting how it will deal with the issue of deprivation of liberty in the context of migration on the African continent. I've been thinking about one expression that will help me to summarize the points that I have actually made, and I found one sitting there at the back. It's the saying that says, The Queen thinks that the world smells like fresh paint. Why? Because when the Queen visits, everybody cleans up. We try to get our house in order. We try to actually provide a very positive impression because, after all, it's the Queen. Now, why do I feel this actually typifies the situation that we face? First, because there is a lot of covering up. Secondly, it's a very sensitive issue, particularly the conversation about deprivation of liberty in the context of national security issues and military operations is a very sensitive issue. Thirdly, we don't have the full picture. We don't have the data. And this study is actually helping us to take the conversation one step forward because it actually provides with something that we can work with. Now, fresh paint is usually temporary. It doesn't actually go deep into the issues that you're facing. The cracks that you're actually allowed to allow the children to fall between, it doesn't help you to address those cracks. And I think it's a shortcoming. And often, we find ourselves tinkering at the edges. Because fresh paint, again, I feel is about tinkering at the edges. And finally, and my final point here, the issue requires a look from the top, the Queen, but also those that are actually stakeholders working on the ground. Otherwise, we are not taking actions, but we're talking actions. Thank you very much.